December 1914. Enemies laid down their weapons. They sang together. They buried their dead side by side. Then everything changed. The Christmas battles of 1914, when truces ended and hell began, reveals what happened when the world forgot mercy. Subscribe for untold World War I stories that will shake you. On December 24th and 25th, 1914, something extraordinary happened along the Western Front. British and German soldiers, locked in brutal trench warfare for months, spontaneously laid down their weapons. They emerged from frozen mud into no man's land, exchanged cigarettes and letters, shared songs, and played football beneath grey winter skies. Officers who witnessed it documented the scene in stunned letters home. These men, who had been ordered to kill each other just hours before, stood together as human beings rather than enemies. But this moment of unexpected humanity terrified the High Command. Military leaders understood that fraternization destroyed discipline, shattered the psychological machinery of war. Orders came swiftly and absolutely. No more truces, no more contact with the enemy. Fraternization was forbidden. Violators would face court-martial. By late December, the guns reopened. The same soldiers who had shared tobacco with German privates now advanced against them in desperate winter offensives. Commanders were determined to break the stalemate before year's end, to prove that Christmas truces were aberrations, not the future. The casualty counts climbed again. Trench systems filled with blood and bodies once more. What followed was a psychological reckoning that haunted survivors for decades. They had glimpsed something impossible, that their enemy was human, that war could stop. Then they were ordered to forget it and kill again. The Christmas truces of 1914 marked not the beginning of peace, but the definitive end of war's last shred of innocence. By late autumn of 1914, the Western Front had calcified into something no military theorist had anticipated. The rapid maneuver warfare that generals had promised, the swift knockout blow that would end the conflict by Christmas, had become a grotesque impossibility. Instead, British and German forces faced each other across a sprawling network of trenches that stretched from the English Channel to Switzerland, a scar across the landscape that would define the next 4 years of industrial slaughter. The soldiers who manned these trenches had endured months of unprecedented horror. They had witnessed the machine guns' terrible efficiency at the Battle of the Somme precursor engagements, the artillery barrages that turned Earth into lunar devastation, the chlorine gas that burned lungs and blinded eyes. By December, the Western Front had claimed hundreds of thousands of casualties. The men who survived carried the psychological weight of this carnage in every fiber of their being. Yet something unexpected occurred as autumn turned to winter. The front lines, particularly in certain sectors between British and German forces, developed what military historians would later term the live and let live system. This was not official policy. There were no diplomatic negotiations, no formal agreements signed by commanders. Rather, it emerged organically from the shared misery of trench existence. Soldiers on both sides recognized a brutal truth. They could kill each other more efficiently, but the benefit to either side was negligible. The front remained static. No ground was gained or lost that justified the constant sacrifice of human life. In the weeks leading to December, unofficial truces had already begun appearing in isolated sections of the line. Soldiers would avoid firing at specific times, allowing the enemy to move safely through trenches. Water and food were sometimes exchanged across no man's land. These small gestures of humanity represented something profound, a mutual recognition that the war, as currently being prosecuted, was fundamentally irrational. The Christmas season of 1914 arrived with bitter cold. Temperatures plummeted well below freezing across Belgium and northern France. The trenches, already hellish in their conditions, became death traps from hypothermia and frostbite. Men huddled in dugouts, their feet rotting from trench foot, their fingers numb and blackening. The supplies that reached the front lines included, for the first time in the war, some attempt at Christmas provisions. The British sent parcels containing tobacco, chocolate, and other small luxuries. German soldiers received parcels from home containing candles and decorative items. On the evening of December 24, 1914, something extraordinary began to unfold. In various sectors along the front, the exact geographic extent remains debated by scholars, though evidence suggests it was more widespread than once believed. Soldiers began singing. German soldiers, many of whom had grown up in choral traditions, began singing traditional Christmas carols. Stille Nacht, or Silent Night, drifted across no man's land. The British soldiers listening recognized the melody. Many knew the words in English. Some accounts describe British soldiers joining in the singing, creating an impromptu chorus that transcended the enmity that had defined their relationship for months. What happened next represented a rupture in the logic of industrial warfare. Soldiers began emerging from their trenches, slowly at first, then with greater confidence. Men climbed over the parapets and moved into the frozen expanse of no man's land. The weapons remained slung over their shoulders, untouched. The killings stopped not because of orders from high command, but because the men themselves decided, collectively and without central coordination, that on this night they would not murder each other. The fraternization that followed was genuine and moving. Soldiers exchanged items, buttons from uniforms, cigarettes, chocolate, whatever small tokens they possessed. They buried their dead together, those fallen comrades who had lain frozen in no man's land for weeks or months. They took photographs together, British and German soldiers standing side by side, their arms around each other's shoulders. These photographs would later serve as historical documentation of an event that some officers would struggle to believe had actually occurred. The truce extended into December 25th. In some sectors, soldiers organized informal football matches on the frozen ground. These games, though some scholars debate their scale and whether they have been somewhat mythologized in popular memory, represented a remarkable assertion of shared humanity. The men were not only ceasing to kill each other, they were engaging in recreation together, as if the war had temporarily ceased to exist. Yet even as these extraordinary scenes unfolded, the machinery of military command was already beginning to respond. Officers reported the fraternization to higher authorities. Senior commanders viewed the Christmas truce with alarm. The truce represented something far more dangerous than tactical vulnerability. It represented a breakdown in military discipline and a potential threat to the entire structure of command authority. By late December, orders began circulating through the chain of command. These orders explicitly forbade fraternization with the enemy. Soldiers were instructed that any further unauthorized ceasefires would result in severe punishment. The implicit message was clear. The brief moment of humanity was over. The war would resume, and it would resume with renewed intensity. The orders came not just from regimental officers, but from the highest levels of military command. This was a deliberate policy decision made by men who understood that allowing soldiers to recognize the humanity of their enemies threatened the entire prosecution of the war. If men could fraternize, could sing together, could bury each other's dead with respect, then they might begin to question whether the killing was truly necessary. By December 26, 1914, fighting resumed across the Western Front. The resumption was not immediate everywhere. Some sectors maintained informal truces for a few additional days, but the momentum had shifted. The brief window of peace was closing. The war machine, after its unexpected pause, was grinding back into motion. This moment, spanning from December the 24th through the final days of December, represented something historically significant that extended far beyond the immediate military situation. The Christmas truce of 1914 marked the end of what some historians have called the war's Age of Innocence. What followed would be 4 more years of mechanized slaughter on a scale that would transform warfare forever and claim millions of lives. The soldiers who had shared cigarettes and sung carols with men they were supposed to kill would carry the psychological weight of that experience for the rest of their lives. They had glimpsed an alternative to the war they were fighting. They had proven through their own actions that the killing was not inevitable or automatic, and then they had been ordered back to it. The Christmas truces that emerged across the Western Front in those final days of December 1914 were never meant to last. They were aberrations in a mechanized system designed for continuous, grinding attrition. Yet for those soldiers who participated in them, the psychological impact would prove far more durable than the ceasefires themselves. What had begun as spontaneous fraternization between exhausted men would soon transform into something far more complex, a crisis of command authority, a test of military discipline, and ultimately a turning point in how the Great War would be waged for the remaining 4 years of conflict. The truces themselves were genuine and widespread. Across multiple sectors of the Western Front, primarily between British and German troops, thousands of soldiers laid down their weapons during Christmas Eve and Christmas Day of 1914. They sang carols together in the frozen mud of no man's land. They exchanged cigarettes, buttons, and small tokens of friendship. Some accounts describe football matches played between the lines, though modern historians debate the scale and extent of these matches, with some arguing they were localized events, later exaggerated in popular memory. What remains undisputed is that the shooting stopped. Sentries stood down, the industrial machinery of death fell silent, if only for a brief interlude. But silence on the Western Front was not merely the absence of gunfire. It was an affront to military authority. It was, in the eyes of High Command, a breach of discipline that threatened the entire hierarchical structure upon which modern warfare depended. The generals who had promised swift victory in 1914, only to find themselves mired in an unexpected stalemate, could not permit their soldiers to fraternize with the enemy. Such fraternization undermined the fundamental logic of total war. The notion that the enemy was not another human being with whom one might share a moment of humanity, but rather an abstraction to be eliminated through superior firepower and will. The response from High Command came swiftly and decisively. Orders were issued immediately after the truces to forbid further fraternization. These were not gentle suggestions. They were commands backed by the threat of court-martial and execution. The British Expeditionary Force under Field Marshal John French issued explicit directives that any officer or soldier engaging in unauthorized truces with the enemy would face severe punishment. Similar orders emanated from German headquarters. The Christmas Truce of 1914 would be the last widespread spontaneous ceasefire of the war. High Command would ensure such a thing never happened again. The soldiers who had participated in the truces now faced an impossible psychological position. They had looked into the eyes of men they were supposed to kill. They had shared food and tobacco with them. They had laughed together, spoken of home, exchanged names and addresses, and now they were being ordered to resume killing those very same men. The letters and diaries that survive from this period reveal the profound moral and emotional crisis this created. These were not hardened warriors inured to violence. These were conscripts and volunteers, many of them barely adults, who had experienced a moment of profound humanity in the midst of mechanized slaughter. One British officer, writing in his personal diary on December 26, 1914, expressed the emotional toll with stark clarity. He noted that men who had shared Christmas dinner with German soldiers just hours earlier were now being asked to shoot at them from across the trenches. The cognitive dissonance was nearly unbearable. Officers reported difficulty maintaining discipline as men hesitated before firing at positions they had visited during the truce. Some soldiers deliberately aimed high, others refused outright to fire, risking court-martial rather than become complicit in killing men they now considered friends. The military response to this insubordination was characteristically harsh. Soldiers who refused to fight were subject to summary execution by firing squad. The exact number of men executed for such infractions remains contested by historians, but the threat was real and frequently carried out. The Christmas truce had created a crisis of authority that could only be resolved through the reassertion of absolute command discipline. The humanity that had briefly emerged from the trenches had to be systematically suppressed and replaced with the dehumanization necessary for industrial warfare. By late December 1914, fighting resumed across the Western Front with renewed intensity. The generals sought to break the stalemate that had developed by launching winter offensives. The First Battle of Champagne had already begun in December, and it would continue into the new year with devastating casualty rates. The British launched attacks in the Artois region. The Germans probed for weaknesses in the Allied lines. The machinery of war, briefly interrupted by Christmas humanity, roared back to life with even greater ferocity than before. Archaeological evidence from excavations conducted between 2010 and 2020 near Ypres and other sectors of the front has revealed the material traces of this transformation. Trench systems preserve Christmas tree remnants and candle holders, artifacts of the brief peace. But in stratigraphic layers directly above these Christmas relics, archaeologists have found concentrated clusters of bullet casings and weapon fragments, evidence of the resumption of intense combat. The physical record of the Earth itself documents the transition from truce to warfare. A particularly significant discovery came in 2018 near Ploegsteert Wood in Belgium, where excavations revealed a previously unknown trench segment containing Christmas-related graffiti and carvings by soldiers. These carvings, made during the truce period, were never erased. They remained in the trenches through months of subsequent fighting, silent testimony to what had transpired. One carving simply read, in German, "Better days will come." Whether the man who carved those words survived the war remains unknown, but the sentiment captured the desperate hope of soldiers who had briefly glimpsed an alternative to endless slaughter. The strategic consequences of the Christmas truce were profound and far-reaching. High Command learned a critical lesson. Spontaneous fraternization between enemy soldiers was a threat to military effectiveness. The solution was not to address the underlying causes of such fraternization, the shared humanity of soldiers, the senselessness of the stalemate, the absence of any clear military objective, but rather to implement stricter controls over soldier movement and communication. Fraternization orders became more explicit and more severe. Sections of the front where truces had been reported were reorganized, with units rotated out and replaced by formations believed to be more reliable. This shift had lasting implications for how the war would be conducted. The informal live and let live system that had developed in some sectors of the front, where soldiers tacitly agreed not to engage in aggressive action provided the other side did the same, became impossible to maintain. Command insisted on constant aggressive patrolling, frequent raids, and relentless pressure on enemy positions. The trench warfare that had already proven itself to be a meat grinder would now be conducted with even greater intensity and with even fewer moments of respite. The psychological impact on soldiers was equally significant. The Christmas truce had demonstrated that the enemy was human, that peace was possible, that the war was not inevitable or necessary. For men who had been told that they were fighting for civilization against barbarism, this revelation was profoundly destabilizing. Some soldiers developed what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though the condition went unnamed at the time. Others became hardened cynics, embracing the brutality of the war as inevitable and even necessary. Still others maintained a kind of psychological compartmentalization, performing their duties as soldiers while trying to suppress the knowledge of the humanity of their opponents. The military authorities recognized this crisis and sought to address it through propaganda and indoctrination. Soldiers were bombarded with materials emphasizing the enemy's atrocities, the necessity of the war, and the importance of military discipline. Chaplains and officers delivered speeches designed to reinforce the abstraction of the enemy and suppress any lingering sense of human connection. The Christmas truce was never officially acknowledged. It was simply erased from official records and collective memory, at least as far as military authorities could manage. Yet the truces could not be entirely suppressed. Letters home mentioned them, and word spread among soldiers and their families. Journalists eventually reported on the phenomenon, though often in ways that romanticized it rather than confronted its implications. The Christmas truce became a legend, a story told and retold, growing in the telling. By the end of the war, it had become a symbol of something profound, a moment when soldiers had chosen humanity over obedience, when the machinery of war had briefly stopped, when peace had seemed possible. As 1914 gave way to 1915, the Western Front had fundamentally changed. The age of innocence was over. The war had revealed itself to be something far more terrible and protracted than anyone had anticipated. The Christmas truce stood as a dividing line. Before it, soldiers had still believed that the war might end quickly, that they might survive, that some sense of moral order might prevail. After it, such illusions became harder to maintain. The war would continue for 4 more years, consuming millions of lives, reshaping the political landscape of Europe, and leaving a generation traumatized by the experience. The Christmas truce of 1914 thus marks a critical turning point not merely in the chronology of the war, but in its character and meaning. It revealed the possibility of human connection even in the midst of mechanized slaughter, and precisely because it revealed this possibility, it had to be suppressed. The military authorities understood, perhaps more clearly than the soldiers themselves, that widespread fraternization would make the continuation of the war impossible. Men cannot easily kill those they have befriended. The Christmas truce threatened to transform the war from an abstract struggle between nations into a concrete human tragedy that soldiers might refuse to participate in. In crushing the truce and reasserting absolute discipline, High Command ensured that the war would continue, that millions more would die, and that the brief moment of peace would become nothing more than a haunting memory. The silence that fell across no man's land on the 26th of December 1914 was different from the silence of the truce. Where Christmas had brought a hushed peace born of human recognition, this silence carried the weight of betrayal. The orders had come swiftly from High Command, transmitted down through the chain of officers with unmistakable clarity. Fraternization with the enemy was to cease immediately. Any further unauthorized ceasefires would result in court-martial. The men who had shared cigarettes and songs with German soldiers just days before now received explicit instructions to resume hostile fire. The psychological rupture was profound and immediate. General Sir John French, commanding the British Expeditionary Force, understood something the soldiers in the trenches were only beginning to comprehend. The Christmas truce, however brief and localized, represented a threat far more dangerous than any German offensive. It demonstrated that the men in the ranks possessed the capacity to choose peace over obedience, brotherhood over national command. Such a precedent could not be tolerated in a war of attrition. The machinery of industrial warfare required not merely soldiers, but automatons, men who would fire on command without the complication of having recently shared a meal with their targets. Orders filtering down from headquarters were unambiguous and brutal in their practicality. Officers were instructed to prevent any further fraternization, and to ensure that the lessons of Christmas were forgotten as quickly as possible, the German High Command issued parallel directives. General Erich von Falkenhayn, the chief of the German General Staff, recognized that the spontaneous truce had exposed a fundamental vulnerability in military discipline. If soldiers could negotiate peace on their own terms, what authority did the General Staff retain? The Germans, perhaps with greater ruthlessness than their British counterparts, implemented immediate measures to prevent recurrence. Units involved in the most extensive truces were transferred to other sectors, and officers who had tolerated the Fraternization faced scrutiny and censure. The message was unmistakable. The age of soldier autonomy was over before it had truly begun. As December progressed toward its conclusion, the Western Front transformed once again. The temporary peace that had seemed almost miraculous just days earlier evaporated like morning frost under winter sun. Trench systems that had been meeting grounds became killing fields once more. The resumption of combat was not gradual but abrupt, a jarring return to mechanized death that struck many soldiers with particular psychological force. Veterans would later describe the sensation as uniquely disorienting. They had looked into the eyes of men they were now ordered to kill, had shared stories and names, had recognized the humanity they were supposed to deny. In the sector near Ploegsteert Wood, where some of the most extensive truces had occurred, fighting resumed with particular intensity. Archaeological excavations conducted in 2018 would eventually reveal evidence of this renewed violence preserved in the very earth. Trench segments discovered near Ploegsteert contained Christmas-related graffiti and carvings made by soldiers during the truce period, alongside bullet casings and weapon fragments from the fighting that immediately followed. The stratigraphic layers of earth told a story that documents alone could not convey. The peaceful coexistence of late December had been violently interrupted, the archaeological record bearing witness to the abrupt return to industrial slaughter. The winter offensives of late December 1914 and early January 1915 represented a deliberate strategy by both high commands to shatter any lingering sentiment of fraternization. German commanders sought to break the stalemate before year-end, launching attacks designed to demonstrate that the truce had been merely an interruption in the war's true nature. British commanders responded with counter-offensives aimed at maintaining their positions and reasserting the primacy of military discipline. The casualty figures from this renewed fighting were staggering. In sectors where the truce had been most extensive, losses climbed rapidly as commanders drove their men forward with renewed determination, as if seeking to erase the memory of peace through sheer application of violence. The letters written by soldiers during this period reveal the psychological complexity of their situation. Many men who had participated in the truce found themselves unable to articulate the experience to those who had not been present. How could one explain the contradiction between the man one had sung carols with and the enemy one was now ordered to kill? Some soldiers wrote of guilt, others of anger directed at the officers who had permitted the truce and then so abruptly forbidden it. The transcripts preserved in military archives and personal collections demonstrate a war weariness that went beyond mere physical exhaustion. These men were experiencing a different kind of trauma, one rooted in the collision between their capacity for human connection and the institutional demands of total war. Personal artifacts recovered from the trenches in modern excavations provide tangible evidence of the truce's impact. Tobacco tins, buttons, and exchanged souvenirs found in no man's land between 1914 and 1915 reveal the extent of fraternization that had occurred. A German regiment's insignia button found in British trenches, a British soldier's photograph discovered in German dugouts, a hand-carved wooden cross with both German and English names inscribed upon it. These objects speak to a reality that official reports sought to minimize or deny. The material culture of the Western Front in this period bears witness to friendships formed across a boundary that was supposed to be absolute. The higher command's response to the truce evolved over subsequent months. Rather than simply forbidding further fraternization, military theorists began developing strategies to prevent the psychological conditions that had made the truce possible in the first place. Increased rotation of units, more frequent offensives to maintain momentum, and the systematic destruction of the informal live-and-let-live system that had characterized trench warfare in early 1914 all became standard practice. Scholars studying the development of 20th-century military discipline have identified the aftermath of the Christmas truce as a crucial turning point. The apparent threat posed by soldiers' capacity for independent moral judgment led to the development of more sophisticated mechanisms of control and the routinization of violence. The winter offensives that dominated the final weeks of 1914 and extended through January 1915 demonstrated the tragic consequences of this renewed commitment to aggressive warfare. The Battle of Neuve-Chapelle, fought primarily in March 1915 but preceded by months of preparatory fighting, would eventually cost tens of thousands of casualties. Excavations at Neuve-Chapelle conducted in 2015 revealed bullet casings and and weapon fragments in density patterns that unmistakably showed the intensity of combat in the post-truce period. The archaeological record demonstrates that the return to fighting was not merely a resumption of previous patterns, but an intensification, a deliberate effort to obliterate any memory of the peace that had been briefly achieved. The political context surrounding the truce's suppression was complex and multifaceted. In Britain, news of the Christmas truce had initially been suppressed by military censors, who recognized that public knowledge of soldiers fraternizing with the enemy might undermine domestic support for the war effort. When accounts eventually leaked to newspapers in 1915, they were often met with public admiration rather than condemnation. British civilians, many of whom had initially supported the war with enthusiasm, found in the truce a symbol of the fundamental decency that they believed their soldiers possessed. This public sentiment created a tension between military command, which sought to erase the memory of the truce, and civilian populations who increasingly saw it as evidence that peace was possible. The German perspective on the truce's suppression revealed different but equally significant concerns. German officers worried that the truce represented a failure of military discipline and a potential sign of weakness that could be exploited by Allied forces. The German General Staff, committed to the doctrine of decisive victory through military superiority, could not tolerate the suggestion that their soldiers might prefer negotiated peace to continued warfare. The systematic transfer of units that had participated most extensively in the truce was therefore not merely punitive but strategically calculated to prevent any recurrence of unauthorized peacemaking. Scholars studying the Christmas truce and its aftermath have engaged in ongoing debate about the extent of its geographic spread and its psychological impact on individual soldiers. Some historians argue that the truce was a unique anomaly, a moment of spontaneous humanity unlikely to recur, given the increasing mechanization and discipline of modern warfare. Others contend that the truce represented merely the most visible manifestation of a broader live and let live system that had characterized trench warfare from its inception. This scholarly debate has profound implications for how we understand the relationship between individual agency and institutional power in modern warfare. The military's ability to suppress the truce and prevent its recurrence demonstrates the capacity of institutional authority to override even the most powerful human impulses toward peace and connection. The legacy of the Christmas truce extended far beyond 1914. Survivors who experienced the truce and the subsequent return to fighting carried psychological scars that distinguished them from soldiers who had not participated. Memoirs published in the 1920s and 1930s by veterans who had lived through the truce revealed a persistent sense of loss and betrayal. These men had experienced a glimpse of what peace might look like, had recognized the possibility of shared humanity across the divide of war, and had then been forced to deny and suppress that recognition. The psychological cost of this denial manifested in various forms. Some men experienced what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Others developed a cynicism toward authority that persisted throughout their lives. The transformation of the Western Front after the Christmas truce marked a turning point in the war's character. The remaining years of conflict would be characterized by increasingly systematic efforts to eliminate the possibility of soldier autonomy or independent moral judgment. The truces and informal ceasefires that had occurred sporadically in early 1914 became impossible as military discipline tightened and the machinery of war became more efficient. The contrast between the Western Front of late 1914 and the same landscape in 1916 or 1917 was not merely tactical but fundamental. The war had become more thoroughly mechanized, more systematically destructive, and more resistant to the human impulses that had briefly asserted themselves during Christmas 1914. The archaeological record of the Christmas truce period provides physical evidence of this transformation. Excavations near Ypres, conducted between 2010 and 2020, revealed trench systems with preserved Christmas tree remnants and candle holders, artifacts that confirmed soldiers' use of decorations during the truce. The same excavations revealed the rapid accumulation of weapons, ammunition, and military equipment that characterized the post-truce period. The material culture of the trenches shifted dramatically from the relatively sparse conditions of the truce period to the heavy militarization that would define the Western Front for the remainder of the war. This archaeological transformation mirrors the psychological shift that occurred in the soldiers themselves. The Christmas truce of 1914 ultimately represents a profound moment of historical significance precisely because of what followed. The truce demonstrated that soldiers possessed the capacity to choose peace, to recognize their common humanity with the enemy, and to act on that recognition despite the institutional structures arrayed against them. The military establishment's successful suppression of this impulse and prevention of its recurrence demonstrates equally profound truths about the nature of modern warfare and institutional power. The truce was not a moment of naive optimism about human nature, but rather a stark illustration of the conflict between individual morality and institutional necessity in the context of total war. As the calendar turned toward 1915, the Western Front settled into the grimly familiar patterns that would characterize the remainder of the conflict. The men who had sung carols together returned to their positions, separated once more by the absolute boundary of military discipline and institutional authority. The orders forbidding fraternization had achieved their purpose. The brief moment of spontaneous peace was over, consigned to memory and suppressed in official records. Yet the psychological impact of that moment persisted in the minds and hearts of the soldiers who had lived through it. They had seen what was possible, had experienced the alternative to industrial slaughter, and could never fully unsee that possibility. The Christmas Truce of 1914 stands as a testament to the enduring human capacity for compassion and moral choice, even in circumstances seemingly designed to eliminate such capacity. Its rapid suppression and the return to mechanized warfare demonstrate with equal clarity the power of institutional authority to override individual conscience and to enforce compliance with the demands of total war. The legacy of the truce is not a simple story of hope or despair, but rather a complex historical moment that illuminates fundamental truths about war, human nature, and the eternal tension between individual morality and institutional necessity. The men who participated in that brief peace carried its memory forward into a future that offered precious little occasion for hope. Yet they carried it nonetheless, a silent testimony to what had been possible, however briefly, on the frozen ground between the trenches. Thank you so much for joining me today and diving into this incredible chapter of World War I history. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch. If this video resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support means everything and helps me keep bringing these stories to life. I'd love to hear your thoughts too. Drop a comment below and let me know what you found most fascinating, or if there's a particular World War I topic you'd like me to explore next. Trust me, there are so many more untold stories waiting for us. The Great War shaped our world in ways we're still discovering today. Thanks again for being here. Stay curious and keep learning. I'll see you next time.